The inbox had 847 unread messages. The oldest one was 63 years old. Yusra Malik stared at the screen. She had not moved in 4 minutes. The analyst. Standing behind her, a young man named Owen Price had stopped breathing. Somewhere around minute 2, he could feel the silence coming off her like heat off an engine block. "Owen," she said. "Commander, when did you find this?" "This morning." The Ottawa archive filter was flagging them as low priority. Diplomatic correspondence, the system, marked anything from an unregistered sender domain as secondary. The Galactic Council's domain wasn't in our approved registry, so every message they sent for 63 years went directly into the spam folder, the secondary correspondence archive. The spam folder. Owen. He did not argue. "Yes, ma'am." Yusra scrolled. She did not read. She scanned subject lines the way a person scans a car crash, not wanting to look, unable to stop. Mandatory attendance, civilizational classification hearing 2061. Follow-up civilizational classification hearing, second notice 2062. Final notice, civilizational status. Review Earth Sector 2063. Invitation, Annual Galactic Council. Summit attendance required for Recognized Civilizations 2064. Ray, Earth's absence from Annual Summit. Formal Inquiry 2064. Ray, Earth's absence second formal Inquiry 2065. She stopped scrolling at 2067. There were still 800 more messages below. "Where is Director Calloway?" she asked. "In a budget meeting." "Pulled him out." "He's with the Senate Oversight Committee." "Pulled him out." Owen left. Yusra did not watch him go. She was reading the most recent message, dated 3 weeks ago, from something called the Galactic Council Civilizational Registry Office. The language was formal and bureaucratic, in the way that only institutions with too much power and not enough accountability ever managed to be. It did not say Earth was primitive. It did not say Earth was small or unimportant or beneath consideration. It used cleaner language than that. It said Earth had been formally classified as a pre-sapient developmental anomaly. It said this classification had been under review for 61 years and had now been finalized given Earth's continued non-participation in Council proceedings. It said this classification, entitled Earth to Observation Status, meaning Council representatives could visit and document the civilization's progress, but Earth would have no voting rights, no treaty protections, no formal recognition under galactic law. It said Earth was, in the Council's official language, a curiosity. Something moved behind Yusra's eyes. Not anger, not yet. Something older and quieter than anger, the thing that lives underneath it. She had seen this language before. Not in space, not in any council document. She had seen it on her mother's asylum application, filed 3 times, rejected 3 times. The language of bureaucratic systems explaining in very clean and formal words why your existence is noted but your participation is not required. The door opened. Director Calloway came in with his jacket half-buttoned. Owen 2 steps behind him. "Commander Malik, I'm in the middle of." "Sit down, Director." He looked at her face and sat down. She turned the screen toward him. She let him read the subject lines. She watched his face go through several stages of a very specific kind of human experience, the experience of realizing that a catastrophic failure happened very slowly over a very long time and at no single identifiable moment. Yala, she said under her breath, not for him, for herself. This was the archive filter, Calloway said. This was a system error. We can send a response. We can explain. We're going to do more than explain. Yusra. They classified us, director, she said. The word classified the way you say a word when the word itself is the offense. They ran a hearing about the legal status of 8 billion people. They ran it 61 years ago. They ran it without us. They finalized it 3 weeks ago, and they put us in a category. That means we don't get a seat at the table. She paused. Our invitation to that hearing is in a spam folder. Calloway rubbed his face. What do you want to do? She had already pulled up a different screen. The United Earth Fleet Registry. Active vessels, current operational status. The number sat at the top of the page in plain, unremarkable font. The way truly large numbers sometimes present themselves without drama because they don't need it. 1012. 1012. Active warships ranging from the small and fast patrol class to the deep space carrier groups that had never once been deployed beyond Earth's own solar defense perimeter because Earth had, for the last 40 years, been busy redirecting, not building toward a war, building away from one. The distinction mattered. It had always mattered. Yusra had written her doctoral thesis on it. She looked at the number for a long moment. Then she pulled up a new message addressed to the Galactic Council Civilizational Registry Office. She typed 4 lines, read them back, deleted the 3rd line, which had been too sharp, and replaced it with something that would read as polite to anyone who didn't know how polite worked. She showed it to Calloway. He read it twice. This is going to get a reaction. Good. A significant reaction. I know. Yusra, 1,000 warships is not a threat, she said. It's a delegation. There's a difference. She hit send. Owen, still standing by the door, cleared his throat. Should I tell the Senate committee you'll be available after lunch? Yusra was already pulling up navigation charts. Tell them I'll be available in about 6 weeks, she said. Tell them we have a meeting to attend. She looked at the spam folder one more time. 847 messages, 63 years of invitations, 63 years of Earth being somewhere else, doing the hard and ugly work of surviving itself while the galaxy held meetings about what to call the quiet little planet that never showed up. She closed the folder. They were going to show up now. The thing behind her eyes that was older and quieter than anger settled into something that felt, if she was honest, a lot like purpose. She had her mother's jaw in her mother's patience. Both had been tested by worse rooms than this. A Galactic Council chamber was just another room. She would bring a folding chair if she had to. The Valorian diplomat's name was Setha, and she glowed soft amber when she was professionally neutral, which was most of the time. She had been dispatched to Earth as a courtesy of formality. The Council had approved her visit under the Observer protocol, the same protocol used when a Tier 1 civilization wanted to document the development of a pre-classified species without interfering in the natural arc of their progression. She had done this work before. She had visited 3 pre-sapient worlds. They had all been fascinating in the particular way that's small and earnest. Things are fascinating, she had written. Good reports. She had felt something like fondness for the creatures she observed. She had not expected Earth to send a car, not a diplomatic shuttle, not a ceremonial escort vehicle, a car. A black ground-running road-bound vehicle that arrived at her landing site on time, driven by a human named Philip. Akefer, who shook her hand without hesitation, did not react to her bioluminescence in any way she could read, and asked if she needed the air temperature adjusted. She said she was fine. He said long flight. She had traveled 6 light years. She said yes. He nodded like this was completely reasonable information to receive before 8:00 in the morning, and merged into traffic. Sitha looked out the window. She had studied Earth from orbital scans and council data files. She had read the historical records as much as the council maintained, which was not extensive given the civilization non-registered status. She had expected something consistent with a Tier 2 developmental civilization, organized settlements, primitive transit, infrastructure, resource consolidation, patterns consistent with early industrial expansion. What she saw out the window did not look primitive. It looked like a civilization that had made a series of extremely difficult decisions and was still paying the price for some of them, and had made peace with that. Philip drove. He did not explain the city. He did not perform it for her. He existed in it the way people exist in places they have known all their lives, without self-consciousness, without distance. She found this more disorienting than anything else. They arrived at the shipyard at 800 hours. Admiral General Kofi Asant was waiting at the entrance. He was 61 years old and built like something that had been tested by weather over a long period of time and had simply declined to change shape. He shook her hand. His grip was steady and entirely without aggression, which was somehow more intimidating than aggression would have been. "Welcome to Dock 7, he said. He did not give her a presentation. He did not hand her a briefing packet. He simply walked and she followed in. The shipyard opened around them like a sentence that kept adding clauses. Dock 7 held 43 vessels in various stages of maintenance. They were large. Not the largest she had seen. The hegemony of Karath maintained ships that made these look modest but large and numerous, and clearly not ceremonial. These were working ships. The humans moving across them moved the way people move when the work is not for performance, fast and specific, and completely indifferent to being watched. "How long has this dock been operational?" she asked. "This specific dock since 2019, but the program, it's part of the Unified Fleet Infrastructure Initiative, started in 2041. "And how many docks are there?" Kofi looked at her with the particular stillness of a person deciding how much of the truth is kind to deliver at once. "We can walk through them if you like." They walked through Dock 8, Dock 9, Dock 10, Docks 11 through 16, which were connected by a transit rail. That took 12 minutes to traverse. Dock 17, which was the largest and which held a class of vessel Seifa, had no catalog entry for. By the time they reached the observation level above Dock 22, her bioluminescence had cycled through amber to pale gold to a color she had not shown in a professional context in many years. She was not cold, she was not performing a response, the color simply happened to her. You had wars, she said it. The way a scientist states a variable. Constant wars for millennia. Yes, Kofi said. With each other. Yes. She looked at the ships, at the humans. On them, at the particular economy of movement that comes from people who have been doing long enough that the doing is in the body. And then you stopped. Mostly, Kofi said, we redirected. That word sat in the air between them. Redirected, the kind of word that does enormous work quietly. She thought about what redirected meant in the context of a species that had been at war with itself for the entirety of its recorded history and had then, over the course of roughly 40 years, pointed that energy somewhere else, not out of peace, not from some sudden flowering of interspecies love, from what she could read in the data, from nothing more elevated than practical necessity. They had looked at each other across the last major ceasefire and done a very human calculation. They had decided that killing each other was expensive and that building was cheaper, and that if they were going to build, they might as well build something that would last. So they had. The council classification, Satha said carefully, describes Earth as presapient, as a developmental anomaly. Kofi didn't look at her, he was watching a repair crew working on the underside of a carrier 3 docks below them. I know what the classification says. Does that bother you? He considered the question with what she was beginning to recognize as characteristic Kofi, a Santhorana, the quality of a person who does not give answers they haven't thought about. My grandmother, he said, was born in a village in Ghana that didn't appear on any official map until 1987. The regional government had a classification system too. The village was listed as an unregistered rural settlement, ineligible for infrastructure, ineligible for formal school funding, ineligible for medical supply chains. He paused. She lived in that village for 60 years. It existed for hundreds of years before that. Satha waited. The map not having it didn't make it not real, Kofi said. It just made the map wrong. She turned back to the ships. The pale gold was still in her skin. She could not make it stop. Your message to the council, she said. Commander Malik's message, it said you were coming to the next meeting. Yes. The next meeting is in 3 weeks in the Outer Rim Council chambers. I know. That is 6 light years from here. I know. You have had no diplomatic presence, no registered ships, no council recognition. You have never attended a session to arrive with. We'll have our paperwork in order, Kofi said. We've been working on it. He said this with the particular serenity of a man who had been working on something for longer than most people understood. Sitha had a question she had been holding since Dock 7. She held it for another moment, then she asked it. How many ships are you bringing? Kofi finally looked at her. The expression on his face was not pride. It was not a performance of power. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It was the look of a person who has prepared for a very long time for something that is now finally beginning. Enough, he said, to make the point without making a threat. She thought about that on the ride back to her shuttle. Philip drove, he did not speak. The city moved outside the window. She watched it and thought about what the word redirected actually meant. When you said it out loud, it meant that everything Earth had ever put into destroying itself, every weapon, every strategy, every engineering mind that had ever designed a thing to end another thing had been turned around. Not disarmed, not dismantled, turned around and pointed outward. Her report to the council that evening was 6 pages longer than standard. She labeled it priority urgent, which she had never done before in her career. Then she sat with the amber of professional neutrality and watched it fail to fully return. The pale gold stayed. She did not know a word for what Earth was. She had been trained in 11 galactic standard classification systems. None of them had a category for this. A civilization that had been burning itself to the ground for 10,000 years, and had then, for reasons that were almost entirely practical, decided to stop. She thought about Kofi's grandmother's village on no map, ineligible for everything still there. She thought about 1,000 ships holding still in the dark, still there. She filed her report. She went asleep. She dreamed in the way her species dreams, in color rather than image, and the color was not amber. It was something she had never dreamed before, something that had no name in her language. She thought in the loose logic of half sleep that Earth probably had a word for it. Earth seemed to have words for a lot of things that the galaxy had not yet found necessary to name. The folding chair was Yusra's idea. The council chamber had assigned Earth visitors observation alcove, a glass-walled box on the upper tier, normally reserved for non-registered entities, journalists from allied worlds, and educational delegations from pre-sapient civilizations who had earned temporary access through the developmental observation program. It had no table. It had no communication terminal. It had padded bench seating and a water dispenser that did not work. Yusra looked at it for approximately 4 seconds when they arrived. Then she went back to the transport, found a folding chair from the equipment supply, carried it through the main corridor of the Galactic Council chamber, past 214 registered delegations, who watched her with a variety of expressions ranging from confusion to deep concern, and set it down on the floor of the main chamber. At the table, not in the glass box, at the table, her colleagues on the Earth delegation were Fleet Legal Counsel Harriet Doyle and Cultural Liaison Officer Nathan Voss. Harriet watched Yusra place the chair and said nothing for a moment. Then she opened her briefcase, removed a small placard, and placed it in front of the chair. It read Earth. She had made it on the flight over, on cardstock with a black marker. It was not laminated. It was not printed. It was exactly what it looked like. Something made by hand, because there had not been time to do it any other way. And because the point was not the quality of the placard. The point was the chair. Nathan looked at the two of them. He was 34 years old and had spent 7 years studying galactic standard, diplomatic protocol, all 11 recognized languages of the Council's primary species, and the 43 formal procedures that governed session entry for visiting non-registered entities. He had prepared extensively for this moment. He sat down in the chair next to Yusra and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The Scythian council chair was named Velashan. He was ancient in the way that ancient things can sometimes be. Not old, in the sense of worn or diminished, but old in the sense of having simply been continuous for a very long time. Seven-limbed pale gray. His species registered stress as a physical shedding of their outer dermis layer, which the council literature referred to as a stress molt, and which looked to human eyes like a person slowly generating dandruff in real time. He did not begin to molt immediately. He was, to his credit, a professional. The floor recognizes, he said, Galactic standard, which Usra's earpiece translated with a half-second delay, that there appear to be individuals seated at the primary delegate table who are not on the session registry. Commander Usra Malik, Usra said, United Earth Fleet, Earth Diplomatic Corps, we received your invitation. A pause. Earth does not have a registered seat at this table. Earth has a chair, Usra said. We brought it. Across the chamber, 214 delegations were doing what delegations do when something unprecedented happens in a room that has not had anything unprecedented happen in a very long time. They were reacting. The reactions were varied. Several species reacted in colors, several in sound frequencies, several simply sat very still, which Usra recognized as its own category of reaction. Setha, the Valorian diplomat, was seated in the Valorian delegation box on the mid-tier. Her bioluminescence was pale gold. She had been pale gold since she arrived. Usra noticed this and filed it somewhere useful. Vila Shan consulted something off screen. Earth's current classification under Galactic Registry Protocol 7, Section 4, is Presapient Developmental Anomaly. Class C. Under this classification, Earth representatives are entitled to observation access only. Participation in primary chamber proceedings is not. Usra placed a document on the table. It was printed, bound, 1,412 pages. She placed it without ceremony, the way you place a thing when you want the thing to speak for itself. Earth's formal response to the presapient classification, she said, including a full review of the evidentiary basis for the original 2061 hearing, the procedural irregularities in a hearing conducted without the subject civilization's knowledge or participation, and Earth's annotated commentary on every galactic treaty signed in the last 63 years that affected Earth's solar system and surrounding space without Earth's consent or representation. A longer pause. That document is 1,412 pages, Velichan said. 1,412. Usra confirmed. We had time on the flight over. Harriet kept her face completely still. Nathan studied a point on the wall with great focus. The chamber was not quiet. Quiet was the absence of sound. What the chamber had was the presence of many different kinds of sound happening at different frequencies in different sections simultaneously. The conversational equivalent of a building settling after a significant impact. Velichan set down his materials. He seemed to be making a calculation of his own. Something about his posture shifted, not dramatically, just a degree or two, the way a professional shifts when they have accepted that the next several hours are not going to resemble what they planned. Commander Malik, he said, Earth's fleet registry as of this morning's update from our monitoring System shows over 1,000 active vessels, currently positioned at the outer edge of this system's approach corridor. Yes, Yusra said. Is this a military posture? Yusra considered the question the way her mother had considered questions from people who held forms that could say yes or no to her future with patience, with care, with the very specific type of restraint that is not weakness but is the decision made consciously not to spend all of your cards at once. We were invited to a meeting, she said. We wanted to be prepared. The chamber noise shifted register. On the upper tier, a craft delegate was speaking rapidly to his aide. The Scythian chair was, very slightly, beginning to molt. A Brenari delegate, a species that registered extreme emotion as a sudden expansion of their outer membrane so that they briefly appeared to double in size, was notably, unmistakably larger than they had been 2 minutes ago. But the humans at the table were not doing any of this. Harriet had opened her briefcase and removed a stylus and was taking notes. Nathan had produced a thermos of coffee from somewhere and poured a cup. Yusra sat with both hands on the table and looked at the council chair with a particular expression she had inherited from her mother, from her grandmother, from every woman in her family who had ever sat across a table from someone who held a form, not anger, not performance of confidence, something quieter, the look of a person who has already decided they are not leaving. Velashin called a 20-minute recess for procedural review. Yusra poured herself water from the dispenser that had been marked non-functional. She pressed the button. It worked fine. She drank it. It tasted terrible. She had expected that. She looked at the placard on the table. Earth, black marker on cardstock, not laminated. Behind the glass of the observation alcove they had not used, a small group of educational delegates from a pre-sapient world she didn't know the name of were pressed against the glass. Watching. She looked at the placard. She had seen that look before, too. On her own face once, years ago before. She had a uniform and a title and a fleet at her back when she was still a girl watching adults sit at tables she was not allowed to approach, holding forms that controlled the shape of her life. She had decided something that year. She had decided it quietly and without announcement, and she had spent every year since building toward it. She reached over and straightened the placard. Earth. The recess ended. The session resumed. Outside in the dark and the cold of deep space, 1,000 ships held perfectly still. They had been holding still for a very long time. It was not patience that kept them still, it was purpose. Same thing that keeps a held breath still, not absence of power, presence of it. Waiting. Sitha did not sleep after the session. She sat in her delegation quarters with the lights at half in her communications terminal open and thought in color the way her species thinks when something has not resolved into language. Yet her natural state was amber. Steady, professional, the warm gold of composed attention. She had been cycling through amber since she left Earth and failing to hold it. The pale gold kept returning, pale gold. In her species meant something between awe and fear. Not the fear of a threat. The fear of something true, that is larger than your current vocabulary. She opened a new document. She stared at the header line where she would normally type the subject. She typed Ray Earth Civilizational Classification Assessment. She deleted it. She typed Ray Earth emergency status. Review. She deleted that too. She sat back and thought about what she had actually seen. She had seen in the shipyards the product of 40 years of redirected violence. That was the right word, Kofi. Asan had handed her the word with the precision of someone who had been waiting to use it correctly. Redirected. Not converted, not reformed. The same energy pointed somewhere else. She had seen in the council chamber 3 humans sit at a table they had not been invited to sit at, with a folding chair and a handwritten placard, and not perform confidence, not perform calm, not manage their bodies the way every other species in that room was managing their bodies, controlling the colors, suppressing the sounds, holding the expansions. They had simply been calm. Satha had studied xenobiology for 11 years. She knew what unmanaged calm looked like. It looked like the Ardni, a species whose nervous system generated almost no stress hormones, placid and lovely, and almost entirely without ambition. It looked like the Marath, who processed anxiety so slowly that what felt like crisis to other species registered to them as mild interest. Human calm did not look like either of those things. Human calm looked like a structure that had been built over time and was holding its shape under load. She had tried to explain this in her report to the council the previous week, and the words had not come. She had written 6 pages and felt, reading them back, that she had described the outside of a building she had never entered. She tried again now. The council's classification system had 4 primary tiers: pre-sapient, which meant a civilization in early developmental stages; developing, which meant emerging toward intersystem engagement; peer, which meant established spacefaring with treaty capacity; and elder, which applied to the 9 civilizations in the galaxy that predated the council itself. Earth did not fit. She worked through the criteria methodically. Presapient was defined by a cluster of markers: no formal intersystem communication, no spacefaring capacity, no unified governance structure, no standardized conflict resolution mechanisms. Earth had all of these. The governance structure was imperfect and sometimes noisy, but it was there. It had been consolidated in 2043, following the resource accords, into a functioning planetary body with actual enforcement mechanisms. Earth was not presapient by any honest measure. Developing required independent spacefaring up to and including the boundary of the home star system, early treaty-making capacity, and demonstrated stability over a minimum of 50 consecutive years. Earth had been operating vessels beyond its home system since 2038. The stability threshold was complicated. By Earth's own history, they had not been stable in the traditional sense. But stability, Satha thought, might not be the right measure. What Earth had instead of the Council's definition of stability was something she didn't have a word for: a quality of continuing, a refusal to stop. She was not sure the Council's metrics captured that. Peer required a fleet complement of at minimum 60 recognized warships and a formal diplomatic history of at minimum 1 registered interspecies contact. Earth had never made formal contact. The Council had sent observers, but Earth had never been told about them. A policy Sitha was finding increasingly difficult to defend the more she thought about it, and Earth's fleet was not 60 ships. Earth's fleet was 17 times the fleet of the largest peer civilization currently registered. This was the number she kept returning to, not because it was frightening, because of what it meant about the classification system. The Council's framework had been designed around a set of assumptions that civilizations developed linearly, that military capacity and diplomatic maturity grew in proportion to each other, that a civilization at Earth's level of diplomatic inexperience would naturally have a correspondingly modest military profile. Earth had broken this assumption not through aggression or unusual intelligence or some singular technological leap. It had broken it by being for most of its history at war with itself. When the wars ended or mostly ended, as Kofi had said, the capacity didn't disappear, the capacity redirected. Sitha thought about the phrase military industrial complex. She had found it in Earth's own literature, a human term, human critique of a human tendency, the tendency to build systems of conflict so deep into the structure of an economy and a culture that they became self-sustaining, not because anyone wanted war, but because the machinery of it had become inseparable from everything else. Other civilizations in the Council's history had faced this problem. The Galactic hegemony had faced it 4,000 years ago. The solution in every recorded case had been long and costly. The capacity had to be slowly, painfully dismantled, factories retooled over generations, military engineers retrained. The cultural framework of organized violence had to be deconstructed almost at the level of identity. Earth had not done any of this. Earth had looked at the machinery of organized violence and decided not to dismantle it. They had decided to build bigger ships. She was not sure whether this was brilliant or something else entirely. She was not sure the distinction mattered. She pulled up the feed from the system's outer approach corridor, the Earth Fleet 1012 ships positioned with precise spacing in a pattern she had asked the tactical analyst to review. The analyst's response had been 3 words, not a threat. And GT snorts. And GT. She had asked him to elaborate. He had taken some time and come back with a longer assessment. It was a holding pattern, a waiting pattern, consistent with a force that had been told to be present and to be patient and to make absolutely no move that could be read as escalation. The ships were doing exactly that. They were there, they were still. They were patient in the specific way that things are patient when the patience is chosen rather than required. She thought about Kofi in the shipyard, the repair crews, the names. She had almost not asked about the names. It had seemed like a small detail, but something had made her pause at Dock 17 in front of a carrier whose whole markings she could not read and ask Philip, who'd been walking behind them, what the ship was called. He had said, that one's the Endurance. She had asked why. He had said simply, because it has been. She had not understood this at the time. She was starting to understand it now. Every ship in the Earth fleet was named for something that had continued past the point where continuation seemed possible. She had spent the evening researching the names in Earth's own historical records. The Endurance was a vessel from Earth's early exploratory period that had been crushed by ice in a polar region and whose crew had survived against all reasonable expectation and walked out. The Resolute, the Perseverance the long road. Patience in her language was amber. The patience in Earth's language was a list of things that had refused to stop. She was not sure the council had a word for this kind of civilization. She opened her document again. She wrote for 2 hours. When she finished, the document was not a classification recommendation. It was something closer to a confession, professional acknowledgement that the tools she had been given to understand civilizations were not adequate to understand this one, and that this inadequacy was not the civilization's problem. She ended with a recommendation she had never made before and did not expect to make again. She recommended that the council suspend its standard classification framework for Earth entirely, not assign Earth to a new category, not create a temporary designation, simply acknowledge that Earth did not fit, that the framework was not wrong, but was incomplete, and that proceeding as if it were complete was a form of dishonesty that the council could no longer afford. She titled the document Preliminary Assessment Earth Civilization Review, submitted for emergency session. She marked it Priority Urgent. She sent it. Then she sat back and the amber returned, slowly, imperfectly, working against the pale gold that kept breaking through. Outside, the ships were still. She thought about the placard card. Stock black marker Earth. She had held official diplomatic credentials for 20 years. She had carried her documentation in a case, sealed with Valorian state encryption, embossed with the council's primary registry mark, backed by 4,000 years of continuous civilizational recognition. She had watched a human woman put a handwritten placard on a table and sit down in a folding chair. She had watched the handwritten placard hold. The vote did not go quickly. Nothing in the Galactic Council ever went quickly. It was an institution built by species, with lifespans and attention spans that varied by several orders of magnitude, and its procedures reflected this, layered with subclauses and referral motions and procedural challenges that could, if properly deployed, extend a single agenda item across multiple sessions. Velashin had been managing this institution for 60 years, and he was very good at it. But he had never managed a session that had 1,000 ships in the approach corridor. Yusra sat at the folding chair and watched the chamber work through its process and did not perform impatience. She felt it, a specific familiar impatience, the one she got in rooms where power moved slowly because the people who had power had the luxury of slow. She recognized it and set it to one side and focused on the work. The work at this stage was mostly listening. Harriet was monitoring the procedural track. She had been in motion since the recess ended, flagging irregularities in the original 2061 classification, hearing with the kind of precise, unhurried efficiency that came from being the person in the room who had read every relevant document before anyone else. She had noted in the first hour that the original hearing had been conducted under a provision that required notification to the subject civilization. She had produced 3 council session records showing this notification had been filed but never confirmed as received. She had noted in the second hour that unconfirmed notification under this provision was grounds for procedural appeal, and that Earth was hereby filing one. Nathan was managing communications. He had translated Yusra's opening statement into 6 Galactic Standard languages before arrival and was now handling the real-time queries coming from 7 delegations who had approached with questions ranging from genuinely curious to nakedly strategic. Yusra held the center. The craft delegation had been the first to signal hostility. The craft hegemony was the largest single military power in the Council, or had been until this morning when the Earth Registry had been entered into the public record and the rankings had silently, irrevocably rearranged themselves. Their lead delegate, a being named Gorathal, had submitted a motion in the second hour to have Earth designated a threat civilization pending a full military review. Vilashan had tabled the motion for procedural reasons. Yusra had watched this happen and understood that tabling was not the same as defeating. The motion was waiting. It would come back. She was ready for when it did. The session broke for the midday interval. Yusra stayed at the table. She ate a nutrition bar from her jacket pocket. She drank the bad water. She read the 1412 page document she had placed on the table, not because she didn't know what was in it, but because she had found over many years that there was something useful about being seen to read your own materials in a room full of people who were expecting you to perform confidence. Instead, confidence was not the point. Preparation was the point. The session resumed. 3 more delegations had submitted written questions to the Earth position. Harriet had drafted responses. Nathan passed them to Yusra. She reviewed, adjusted 2 phrasings that were technically accurate but carried overtones she didn't want and returned them. Then Velashan reached the point in the session that everyone in the room had been navigating toward without saying so. The classification vote. Under Galactic Registry Protocol, civilization's classification could be challenged, appealed, and revised by a 2/3 majority of the seated delegation. Earth had submitted a formal challenge. The Council was required to vote. The categories on the table were the 4 standard ones: pre-sapient, developing, peer, elder, which no one proposed because it was self-evidently not applicable, and then quietly a 5th option appeared on the session record. Setha had submitted it in her overnight report, and Velashan had, somewhat to Yusra's surprise, allowed it onto the ballot. Undetermined, pending further assessment. It was not a classification. It was, by the Council's own precedent, a procedural holding status that had been used exactly twice in the Council's history, both times for civilizations whose status was being actively disputed and needed to be suspended while the dispute was resolved. It had never been used for a civilization that showed up with 1,000 warships. It had never been used for a civilization that anyone was genuinely uncertain about classifying. It was being proposed, Asra understood, because the Council did not have a word for Earth, and someone, at least one someone, was honest enough to say so. She looked across the chamber to where Setha sat. The Valorian diplomat's bioluminescence was pale gold. Asra had read Setha's report that morning. A delegate aide had passed it to Nathan with no explanation, which was its own kind of explanation. She held Setha's eyes for a moment. Then she looked at the vote board. It opened at 9:30. The first delegation's entry appeared pre-sapient, unchanged. Asra had expected this. Some delegations had their positions before the session started. She did not move. Second, developing. Third, peer. Fourth, presapient. Fifth, undetermined pending further assessment. The votes accumulated. The chamber was doing its thing, the colors, the sounds, the expansions and contractions of species who could not help registering what they felt as they felt it. Usra sat and breathed and looked at the board. Aboard the flagship, 6 light minutes away, Admiral General Kofi Asante was watching the same board. His comms officer, a young woman named Lydia Frost, had been monitoring the session feed. She turned from her station and said, "Sir, they're voting." "I know. The threat civilization motion is still on the table if the vote doesn't resolve." "I know, Lydia." She turned back to her station. A moment later she turned again. "Should we move the fleet even just further back to signal non-aggression?" Kofi was quiet. On the board, more votes were coming in, no clear majority. Numbers spreading across the 5 categories in a pattern that looked less like an election and more like a record of a room that did not agree. "We're not here to threaten anyone," he said. "Sir, with respect, we already are." He looked at the board. "I know," he said, "that's different." She didn't ask him to explain. She had worked with Kofi long enough to know when a statement was complete, he meant being a threat and threatening are not the same action. One is a condition, the other is a choice. Earth's presence here was a condition, the accumulated result of 40 years of redirected effort, now simply existing in the same room as the galaxy it had been excluded from. They had not pointed the ships at anything. They were just there. Being there was enough. The vote closed at 11:40. No majority, not in any category. Precipient, 31 votes. Developing, 29 votes. Peer, 44 votes. Undetermined, pending further assessment, 67 votes. Not a majority. The 67 was the largest single group, but it was not 2-3. The classification failed to pass. Earth's challenge was upheld by technical default. You could not maintain a classification that had been formally challenged and then failed to achieve majority support on revision. Earth was at this moment constitutionally unclassified. In 214 sessions of Galactic Council history, this had never happened. Velashin looked at the results board. He was molting gently, which in his species was the equivalent of a very controlled exhale. He looked at the Earth delegation at the folding chair, at the handwritten placard. "Commander Malik," he said, "in light of the vote's outcome, the Council must ask, what does Earth want from this body?" The chamber went very quiet. The many-frequency kind of quiet, that is. Actually many sounds all choosing simultaneously to wait. Yusra looked at the placard, card stock, and black marker. She had made it herself because there had not been time to do it any other way. She thought about the spam folder. 847 messages, 63 years of invitations to a meeting that was about to begin. She thought about her mother's asylum application, filed 3 times, the language of forms, the careful formal explanation of why your presence is noted but your participation is not required. She looked at the vote board, at the 67 votes for a category that was not a category, from delegations who had been honest enough to say, "We don't know what this is." She stood up, not for drama, simply because some things are said standing. "A seat," she said, A real one at this. Table with voting rights treaty, protections, and formal recognition. Under galactic law, she looked at Velashan directly, and someone rewrites the charter, the classification system you are using was designed for a galaxy. That did not include us. It needs to be updated. The chamber sound returned slowly. She sat back down. She picked up her water, drank it. Still terrible. She had expected that. Nathan poured himself more coffee. Harriet continued taking notes because the session was not over, and there would be follow-up procedures, and there was always more work to do in a room after the moment everyone had been waiting for. Outside in the dark between stars, 1,000 ships held their position. They had been still for 11 hours. They were not impatient. They were not restless. They were what they had always been, a product of everything Earth had survived to build, waiting with the particular quality of something that has been ready for a long time and is not surprised to finally be here. The ships were named for things that had refused to stop. The endurance, the resolute, the long road, the patience that was not amber, and had no word in Sitha's language, but had many words in Earth's. Many, many words. Velashan called a second recess. The chamber broke apart into small groups, and urgent conversations, and the business of a galaxy realizing slowly that its map was wrong. Yusra stayed at the table. She straightened the placard one more time. Earth. The white space around it was not empty. It was the pause before the next sentence, the specific beat that belongs to things that have waited long enough and are now finally beginning to be heard. She was her mother's daughter. She had her mother's jaw and her mother's patience. Both had seen worse rooms. Neither had ever left a table before the work was done.